This morning. Got some that are coming in towards the back. Cold and rainy day here. Good news is it's as warm as it's almost probably going to be the rest of the day. So enjoy it. Enjoy the heat. Glad that you're here this morning. Let some of those coming in here. Beginning technically a new quarter today. But before we begin, though, let's have a word of prayer. Father, we're thankful for the day, for our blessings. We're thankful for the time that you've given us to study some of your word, and we pray that much good would come from it during this time, both from teachers and from those that are listening as well. Bless us in all we do for you. It's in Jesus' name. Amen. Like I said, we're going to start a new quarter today, technically. Jake needed a couple more weeks to kind of finish up the book of Psalms. I'm always glad to let someone do that because that means I'm not the only one that struggles in the quarter keeping the lessons within the quarter system. So that means he struggles as well. So I'm always glad to let him do that. And so he finished up the book of Psalms, and we're going to start something today. We're going to start looking at the book of Luke, but we are going to kind of take a little bit different approach to it with only, I think we have 10 or 11 classes between now and the end of the quarter. And rather than go verse by verse and kind of look at things in order, we will certainly look at the things that take place in the book of Luke. But I thought that we would take a little bit different approach to it. And when we start looking at the text itself, I want to start looking at some difficult passages from the book of Luke and look at some things perhaps that Jesus said or did, or some things that took place in that book that there might be a little struggle with us to understand what was happening. Why is it, for example, that Jesus told one to not touch him and then later on told another one to come and touch him, told Thomas to come and touch him, or why do we hear Jesus tell people not to tell people who he is? So some difficult passages that we'll look at rather than going verse by verse as is certainly what I normally do, but I don't want to take too much time with it. But I thought today we would do a little introduction. When you open your Bible to the New Testament, there is a blank page between Matthew. It's probably maybe more than one page, but there's a page between Matthew and Malachi, and there's a little gap right there that doesn't look like much when you're just flipping through those little pages, but it actually represents around 400 years of history that as far as inspiration is concerned, we have no record of. God doesn't speak from the time of Malachi till the time of Matthew, and so when you close your Old Testament from Malachi, you read about certain things that don't appear anymore in the New Testament. And when you open the New Testament, you read about certain names and places and people and ideologies that you can't find in the Old Testament. And that's because they developed during that 4 centuries or so between Malachi and Matthew. And so, for example, Luke chapter 1 verse 5 says, "In the days of Herod the king." And I want to focus our time today on that phrase that we see there in verse 5 that gives us a date, it gives us a time period that the book of Luke is going to open his account with. We'll talk more about an introduction to the actual book itself in another class, but I thought today we would look at the days of this person and look at him himself, because that name Herod appears quite a bit in our New Testament in the gospel accounts and in the book of Acts. However, the Herod that you read of may not, and almost probably is not, the same one from Luke chapter 1, verse 5. And so I thought we would begin this looking at Luke, looking at this man Herod, to get a better understanding of who he is and the time period in which Luke first opens his account. Of course, Luke, like the other 3, are going to be talking about Jesus, the gospel, Jesus' birth, his life, his death, and his resurrection, though John doesn't mention his birth. But these other 3 mention something about him and his earlier days, especially Matthew and Luke, and we'll look at some of those things. But let's notice the days that were involved in that, and I'll try to suppress the history teacher within me to go off on these wild tangents. That's one of the reasons I have these PowerPoints, is to keep me in line and not go too far into that boring stuff to some of you. But let's notice the days of Herod the king. An introduction to Luke, and we'll notice Herod. We'll notice also some of the Jews. For example, who are the Pharisees, Sadducees, some of these other people? They don't appear in the Old Testament. Where do they come from? We'll notice them in our time together here in this introduction. Not today, but we'll look at those others next time that we are together. As when you talk about any time in history, there's a little bit of work you have to do on the front end to kind of get your bearings. If you were to wake up in the middle of a city somewhere or in the middle of a place anywhere on our map, first thing you'd have to do is orient yourself. Where are we? Where is it that I want to go? And what do I need to understand in order to get from where I am to where I want to go? Sam mentioned very briefly in the beginning of his class that he's doing on Wednesday night about Alexander the Great. In the mid-300s BC, this is before Jesus, Alexander the Great has this empire that is before you. All of the colored region, just to give you an idea, Greece is on the far left or the west, and going all the way to what is presently Pakistan or India on the far east. And so he owned or conquered all of this area and did it in an incredibly swift period of time. Reaches the Indus River over there and stops only because his soldiers said, that's enough, we want to go home. And so that's as far as he got there, and all the way down into Egypt as well. So he ruled all of this. But at the time of his death, when he was around 30 years of age, he rules this empire that had he had no descendants. He had no one to inherit the throne. And so 4 of his generals, the strongest ones, took the various colored regions that you see around us here. The Ptolemies, for example, took Egypt. They're the purplish, reddish color there on the map. The Seleucids are the ones in the east. They're the bluish kind of color. And so they kind of separated the empire into their own empires. And while they kind of got along, there was certainly this need to be the next Alexander. As great as he was, we want to be just like him. And so certainly as the places where these colors collide, there's going to be this back and forth, push and pull. And so a couple of these new empires, they call this the Didache, is the name for this kind of conglomeration here. The places where they connect, the 2 of these empires are going to become more powerful than the others and kind of absorb the others. And I've already mentioned them. The Ptolemies and the purple in Egypt there, whatever color that is, and blue here on the east, the Seleucids. Those are the 2 ones that kind of become more and more powerful. Let's zoom in inside that square right there. And again, I have to use a new map with new colors and that sort of thing. And so the yellowish color is the Seleucids. They were the ones on the east in our last map, and the Ptolemies are there in Egypt towards the southern part of this map. And this is, again, 300s, 200s, getting closer to the time of Jesus. But I want you to notice in the center, between the yellow and what is now blue, I suppose, there is what we call the modern day Israel, is right in there. And the reason why it's colored the way that it is right here is because that is a very tense point where it's hard to say who controls that area at any one time during history. I'll back out a little bit here, but one of the unfortunate, I suppose, things about Israel, the location of it, is, as with real estate, location, location, location. Israel is located between 2 or 3 major world empires. If you talk about the Assyrians and the Babylonians to the east, or you talk about the Egyptians or the Romans and Greeks to the west. And so they sit right in the middle of these cross sections between these empires. And so when you read about the Assyrians coming and destroying the northern part of Israel, or Babylon coming and taking Jerusalem, or Rome is eventually going to take this area over as well, it's not because Israel or Jerusalem were significant. These areas were very insignificant when it came to wealth. Other than Solomon and the United Kingdom, there was very little wealth in this part of the world, Israel talking about. The reason why you have all these empires coming through here is because they're on the way to the other empire. Egypt is the breadbasket of ancient civilizations. If you owned Egypt, and especially the Nile, you could feed your people. And so the Assyrians wanted to go to Egypt. They needed to get to Egypt in order to expand their food supply. Same with the Babylonians, Rome as well. And so on their way, especially Assyria and Babylon, Israel was kind of just a stop along the way. And so it's the same thing with these newer empires. This is the Grecian empire in a way. These are all Greeks that are there. Ptolemy that rules Egypt. He was Greek. His descendants continue to rule that area. You're familiar with Cleopatra. There were several Cleopatras, but the one that you're familiar with, she is an Egyptian princess, queen. She's not Egyptian, she's a Greek, because she is in that line of the Ptolemies that are there. And so the Seleucids, the yellow color, and the Ptolemies continue to fight or to try to push each other out of this area right here. Not necessarily because they wanted the area, but because they wanted more and more of each other's territory. And so it was just kind of in the way. And so one of the tools that they would use in order to consolidate their power in the area is to use local noblemen, wealthy people, those who had some sort of, we wouldn't call it an army, but they had their own soldiers that they could pay to fight for them. And one of those people that was in pretty much, if I go back to the map there, the dotted line of between the yellow and the blue at the bottom, south of Jerusalem. In that area lived, among other people, a man named Antipater. And the fact that he is Antipater the first means he had children, and he's also important because we number the people that have some kind of rule that are important. And he lives between this time period, this is 114 to 43 BC. Keep in mind, BC means before Christ, and the numbers count down to 1. And then the ones after it, which is what we are in today, we call them AD, and then the number. The letters AD stand for Anno Domini, which means the year of our Lord. And so that's the dating of the years there. So he lived about 100 years before Jesus and dies a few decades before Jesus is born, depending on when exactly that was. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But Antipater here is from a place called Idumea. Biblically speaking, the Old Testament would call that Edom. This is the Edomites. These are traditionally the descendants of Esau. And so the Idumeans that were living here claimed to be descendants of Abraham. Jacob and Esau, they claimed to be descendants of Abraham the same way that Israel did, although they were not Israelites. They were, distant cousins of them. And so that was not only a tense tension between the Jews and the Edomites, it was also something that could be useful to the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, and eventually the Romans, because we've got someone who is from this area. His family goes back a long time. Perhaps he's one of the people that we could use to fight the other side that's there. He also marries a Nabatean woman. This is from Arabia, a noble woman. And just to try to consolidate power more, this Idumean converts to Judaism. And so he uses all of this. He's married into a wealthy family. He himself was wealthy. And also because he was the same religion of most people in southern Israel, Judea at the time, the major empires looked to him as kind of the best option to help kind of restrain that area for us. I want Antipater to be on my side because he has all of these points where he's connected, he has all of this power, and so they're going to try to use him in this. When he's an adult and after he's married and has been converted, we have what historians tell it the Roman Civil War. You remember that Julius Caesar was becoming what we would call an emperor, and he was consolidating power, but there was this other man who, had he won, we wouldn't be talking about Caesar today, we would be talking about Pompey. He was the rival. And so these two were fighting it out, basically, to figure out who was going to be the next ruler of Rome, or the first ruler, I guess, of the new Roman Empire. And one thing you need to do if you ever find yourself a wealthy person, and you find there a civil war happening, it's very important that you pick the right side. Okay, and by right, I mean you need to pick the winner, and you need to pick him early. Because if you can pick the winner and he eventually wins, he's going to give you lots of things afterwards for picking him so early on. Unfortunately, Antipater is not sure which one of these guys is going to win. Both of them are Romans. He also has the Greek pull between the two other areas that are pulling him. And so at first he supports Pompey, who is eventually going to lose. However, he starts to realize that maybe his life would be a little bit better if he would throw his support behind Caesar. On one occasion, Julius Caesar is surrounded in the city of Alexandria, which is in Egypt, and he is besieged in a castle, a fortress that is there. And Antipater, along with several other people, actually invade Egypt, and they save Julius Caesar. And Antipater has part of the battle that's there. Later on, when Julius Caesar is looking into who all helped him, someone accuses Antipater of not being on Caesar's side. Hey, you were with Pompey. You were on his side. You had picked him long ago. You're an enemy of Caesar. And there's this semi-famous story of Antipater. He's the one kind of in the center right, who's looking at his side. Julius Caesar is on the throne there. This picture is from 1700, so a long time after the events. But when they accuse Antipater of being on Pompey's side, he tells the story of being at that siege and saving Caesar, and then he shows them the scars that are on his body from the battle that he had been at. And so he says, no, I was with Caesar, and here are the scars to prove my devotion to Caesar. I've always been for Caesar. And so he's switching sides, but he does it in a very effective way. And so Caesar picks Antipater and is grateful to him, makes him a Roman citizen, frees him from taxes, and showers him with other honors and glory. If we look at the Apostle Paul, sometimes we point out how instrumental he was, how, what's the right word? He was a Jew, he was intelligent, but he was a Roman citizen. He was part of the Jewish noblemen. And so he had a lot of really important things that made him useful to God. That same kind of thing could be said about Antipater. He's kind of a Jew, he's an Idumean, so he's half. He's not quite, but you can squint your eyes and he kind of is. Now he's a Roman, he's a ruler, he is someone who has a lot of money. And so the Romans, now that they've kind of pushed the Greeks out of the area, are now going to want to spread their influence here. And they use Antipater. Julius Caesar here appoints him as the procurator of Judea. Procurator is another word for a steward. Think of Joseph in the Old Testament. He's the procurator of Potiphar's house. And so that same sort of thing. So he's not a king, not really a ruler. However, he is the steward of this area called Judea. And this friendship that he has with Caesar allows for a great degree of freedom as far as how they govern themselves. Understand that the Romans were, like many ancient people, they were intelligent. And while they liked the conquering and they liked the empire building, they didn't like the governing part of it. Putting down revolts and forcing people to learn their language and forcing them to pay taxes, that was just burdensome. And so they found that if they would take someone from the area who knew the people, knew the area, and they made him the leader of that region, that he would do all the hard work for them. And as long as there was peace in the region and they didn't have to send Roman soldiers to put down a rebellion, they kind of left everybody alone. Send me taxes, claim allegiance to Rome and to Caesar, and we'll just kind of let you do your thing. And so they find Antipater to be one of these people that can start to rule and do the things that they need him to do. And so Antipater names two of his sons as governors of this area. I'm kind of the leader here, but I want my sons, who are adults at this time, I want them to govern part of my region. So one, called Phaziel, I'm going to put in charge of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. And my other son, named Herod, I'm going to put in charge of Galilee, the northern part of Judea, Israel today. So Galilee is where this one is. And this is where this man comes on the throne. This is Herod, and this is Herod the Great, is what he is known in history. Biblically speaking, we wouldn't call him so great. However, Herod is the one that we'll look at here briefly. Let's finish with Antipater, though. This is his father. So Julius Caesar is murdered in 44 BC. Remember you also, Brutus, et tu, Brute, is murdered there by the Senate. And again, if you pick the wrong guy, you're going to become a marked man. And so Caesar is murdered, and then all of those who had picked Caesar and were his supporters suddenly became worried about their own lives. Antipater certainly being one of those. He had a lot of enemies, and so he himself was poisoned in 43 BC. So just a year later is poisoned by some aristocrat there in Judea. And so that leaves this region basically without this strong leader. Herod didn't have a lot of power, neither did his brother Phaziel. He actually dies just a few years later, Phaziel does. And Antipater dies here, and there's really no leader in the area. So with Antipater poisoned and dead, Herod actually flees, and he goes to the place of power. If I want to maintain that place of power or get more than even my father had, I need to go talk to the Romans. And so he goes to Rome. And he begins to ingratiate himself with the Romans, particularly the Senate and those who were leaders. Yes, my father supported Caesar, but I'm all about you guys. You guys are my favorite. I've always been a big Senate person. And so he ingratiates himself to the Senate. I don't want to say they were impressed with him, but it was more like, hey, this is kind of a good enough solution. He's come to us, so sure. So the Senate votes him to be king of Judea. And not only that, they give him something very important, and that is an army. And so they want him to go back to Judea. They don't really care what he does with Judea. They just want him to put down any kind of revolt that's going on. Again, it's going to become stable. They're going to send Rome taxes. That's all they're really concerned about. It's not really about who's doing what and whatever. Just keep it peaceful and do what you need to do. So Herod takes this army, and he returns to Judea. And this is about 37 BC. And he takes over, kind of defeats any of the local warlords who might be trying to consolidate their power. And he begins to reign as the king of Judea, as a client king of Rome. That means while Luke 1:5 says Herod the king, he wasn't the king. He was just the king in this area. He was ruling for the Romans. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. His rule would last about 32 years. We think they usually date him around 4 BC when he died, which, think about that for just a moment, and let's see if we've got any questions. 4 BC. He died 4 years before Jesus was born, at least as far as we date that. How do we reconcile that? Say again? Yeah, these BC and AD dates are not exact. We've had several hundred years after Jesus. That's when they started to develop this calendar that we use. And someone took a guess and said, well, I think it was about 600 years ago when Jesus was born. And that's when they started. And so it's off, but not by much. And so Jesus was probably born around 6 BC. And I'll mention why I think that in just a little bit. But Herod the Great is the one who is here in Luke 5, and you kind of see you see why he was in power at the time, and then we'll notice more about him here in a moment. But any questions or comments you want to make there? I speak quickly, especially when I talk about stuff like this. I want to get a little bit of a background on Luke before we begin. Just throw your hand up or make a noise, and I'll try to stop. Now, Herod, again, who gave him his power? That was Rome. Rome gave him his power, and so he wanted to do everything he could to impress the Romans. Literally everything he did seems to be meant to impress Rome. He Hellenized the court and culture. Hellenize is another word for Greek. He Greekified all of the area, made the buildings to look more Grecian, demanded that people begin to speak Greek in the courts or the laws anyway. And many other things were made to reflect Greek culture. He brought in Palestine's first Olympic Games into this area. Again, we want to be like Rome, who themselves were trying to be like the Greeks. He founded several Greek cities in Samaria, and he also built a few cities called Caesarea. There are 2 mentioned in our Bible, Caesarea Maritima, which is on the sea, and Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus asked his apostles or his disciples, whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? And you can see the word Caesarea, it has the word Caesar in it. I mean, he just built a city and said, I'm going to name it after Caesar. So again, ingratiating himself to the Romans and to the soon-to-be next emperor, or the first, I suppose, who was coming to the throne, Augustus, who would be there soon. And so he's building these cities. He's adding a lot of Greek culture, architecture, other things there. He built several fortresses, this was important to the Romans. He built several fortresses and palaces, and he allowed the Romans to use them anytime they wanted to. There's an account there in Acts 21, verse 34, where there's a rebellion of sorts there because of Paul in Jerusalem. And we're told that the soldiers came out of, the King James says, castle, and they were pulling Paul back in, or else he was going to be killed by the mob. That castle, or that fortress, is one of the places, I'll show you a picture of it in a moment, of one of those castles or fortresses that Herod built, and the Roman soldiers were just using it in order to maintain peace in the area. And so he's called great by historians because of his building programs. He built all kinds of stuff, aqueducts and harbors and fortresses and temples and all kinds of other things. So he's great as far as a builder might be concerned. Now, because he was changing the culture, changing the way things had always been done, at least in their minds, this angered the Jews. And the rulers of this area, all of them, were constrained only by how well they maintained peace. Think about Pilate. Pilate was a Roman ruler in the area. He had been put in place there at the time of Jesus. He had all this power and authority to do whatever he wants to allow Jesus to go free. But why didn't he? Why didn't Pilate just do what he knew was right? He was afraid of the Jews. Because if the Jews told Caesar or they rebelled, he was going to lose at best his job. And so this is something that even Herod, as powerful as he was in this area, he was still constrained by how well the people behaved under his rule. So he's kind of walking this tightrope between making the Romans feel like he's one of them, but he also wants the Jews to be kind of happy with him. And so he considered himself to be one of them. He followed and practiced the Jewish religion. He was technically related to them. They didn't think of it that way, but he kind of, I'm one of you guys, but he was also one of the Romans. And so this angered them. And so Rome would obviously become very upset if the Jews revolted and they had to spend time, resources, and soldiers to go and put down a revolt in an insignificant part of the world, over there in Judea. There's nothing there. Why are we doing this? And so they get upset and they put someone else in charge once they put the revolt down. So Herod needed to find something to gain popularity. I need to do something that is going to make the people just think, you know what, he's not so bad. Not such a bad guy. And that thing was rebuilding the temple. So we're going to talk, we read about Jesus going to the temple and we read about it a good bit. Jesus, on one occasion, when the disciples pointed out to him, they say, look how great this temple is in this area here. And Jesus said, well, there's coming a time when not one stone is going to be left upon another. And they freak out. They said, when are these things going to be? When is the end of the world going to be? It's this temple that they were looking at. Now, the temple before Herod had been in just disrepair for about 500 years. Remember that Zerubbabel had come back from captivity, and he and a number of others, Nehemiah and others, were there rebuilding the wall, rebuilding the temple. But remember that when the temple was completed, that those who were old enough to remember the first temple, Solomon's, cried because it didn't hold a candle to what the first one looked like. So it started off poorly, the second one did. And it had gone for 500 years with very little done to it. You go a couple of days without putting away some things or straightening up, and the house is a mess. Think about 500 years of doing not a whole lot, using it, but not doing a lot of repairs. It was in disrepair, to say the very least. And so Herod looked at this as kind of a building project that he could do that would make him great in the minds of the Romans, but would also make him respectable or acceptable, I suppose, with the people that he was ruling, the Jews. So it was lying in disrepair and was inferior to both the former temple, that no one at that time knew what it looked like, But it was also inferior to many of the Greek temples that were in the surrounding area, but also that Herod had started to build, which also made people upset. And so Herod went about trying to build this new temple on top of the one that was already there. The Jews at the time said, no way, you can't do that. Because in their minds, if Herod tore down the temple, the first one, the Zerubbabel's that was there, the existing one, he was never going to rebuild another one. And so he was going to tear it down and put up a Greek temple or something like that. Possibility. That's certainly within his MO. But they wouldn't let him do it. And so they said, you can't do that. You've got to come up with a compromise. And so Herod did. And so he actually promised to build the next one, the second one here, around the first one, all the while keeping the first one still going. So he was renovating it from the outside in, building new things, repairing those things that need repaired, all the while the services of the temple were still going on. So when you read about Jesus walking through the temple or he's in Jerusalem here, understand that unless religious services were going on, you would hear the noises of work being done on the temple itself. In fact, when Jesus is on the Mount of Olives and he says, not one stone is going to be left upon another, there were more than likely scaffolds in various parts of the temple. It wasn't completed until well after Jesus' death. This was still going on. So his whole life, this temple was still in being built and being repaired. But he had to promise, you're not going to tear down the first until you've completed the second one. So this was a wild building project. It's considered one of the greatest building projects in the first century because of what had to be done and the ingenuity of those architects who were building it. So he didn't interrupt any of the services of the temple. It kept going all the while work was being done here on the second. Some of the things that he did in order to get this done, he hired thousands of Jewish workers. Think about an elected official who promises to bring in lots of new jobs. That's going to get you some brownie points with the people that you've been elected by. And so he hires thousands of people. Now more people have work, and he didn't bring in people from Egypt or Rome. He hired the people there. That's good. That certainly gets them liking him. He also, because he himself considered himself to be a Jew, he followed the Jewish religion. He knew that there were parts of the temple that only certain people could go in. Think for a moment if he had hired a Gentile, Roman or somebody, or a Samaritan or somebody like that, and he asked them or had them go into the holy place and start doing the things inside there to renovate. That would have been just awful. That would have desecrated the temple and really got people upset. And so he knew the law. He knew what the law said. And so he hired priests and trained them in the architecture and the other things that they were doing so that they could go into the places that were off limits to most people. So he's smart, certainly, wants to ingratiate himself here to the people. But one of the things that they had to do was to start off with in order to begin. Anytime you build a building, you've got to make sure your foundation is secure. You got to build that foundation first. What Herod had in mind for a temple was not going to fit where the new temple was. And so they had to start by widening the base. You're familiar with this picture, I'm sure. This is modern day Jerusalem. This is the Temple Mount and where the temple sat. The building there in the center with the golden dome, we sometimes mistake for a mosque. Muslim, it's not a mosque. That's actually the place where they claim Muhammad ascended on a winged horse to visit with God. And so it's a shrine, it's not a mosque. So the mosque is actually at the bottom of the screen, that gray building with its own gray dome. Not that it matters, but just thought I'd mention it while we're here. And so if we were to go back in time, Solomon and Zerubbabel's temple would take up that red square that's right there. That's where the original temple sat. We're looking from the south, by the way, south to north, with the Kidron Valley on the right and the Tyropoeon Valley on the left. Ancient Jerusalem was picture it like an upside down triangle. Valleys on the sides, very well defended as far as geography is concerned. By the way, the western wall, the Wailing Wall, is on the west, on the left side of the square, bottom left of the square is where the current Jews go. That's the original Herod's temple that he built. That's the original artisanship and stone masonry that's there. And so this is the original temple. Herod had a much bigger thing in mind. And so they actually had to widen the base, and they had to build out, and if you can see, I know it's difficult to see, but if you can see the bottom right there, it looks like a wall, but that's actually just a really large retaining wall foundation that kind of comes out from the side of the mountain that drops to the valley. You'll remember one of the temptations of Jesus that he was taken, it says, to the pinnacle of the temple. And and Satan told him to throw yourself off and the angels will catch you. It doesn't mean that he went to the top of the temple building. It meant that he more than likely went to the edge of that wall, and Satan said, throw yourself off into the valley below. So he went to that edge of that retaining wall, or the edge of that foundation, and it was a long way down, and Satan said, go ahead and jump. The angels will catch you. You're not going to dash your foot on a stone. And so this part had been built out so that the new temple could be built on top of the original. And so this is where, this is how it looks. So they had to widen the base here from where it was. And when it was finally completed, and again, it wasn't completed until about 63, 64, somewhere around there, AD. And so a lot longer after Jesus and even after Herod had died. If we were to take this view right here, and if we were to go around to the right side and look at it from the east, this would be the view of what was the finished temple. And so this is from the east looking west. And you see there in the middle is the temple. This is a model that if you go to Jerusalem, there's this outdoor model, and it's quite large. Not that I've been there, but I can tell from the picture. If you were to stand in the middle of it, the walls in the temple would come up to about your knee. I mean, it's a massive. There's someone off picture that I can tell the scale of it here. But this is how it would have looked. And you'll notice a lot of the columns, the architecture is very much Greek in style. I mentioned just a little bit ago the fortress, the castle that was there in Acts 20:21. If you look in the upper right corner, there are these 4 turrets or 4 towers. That is the fortress that Herod built so that the Romans could use it whenever they wanted to. And so they were there, and that's right in the center of what would have been the hotbed of activity for revolt. And so you have these Roman soldiers who were there, not in the temple itself, but they were just outside it, and they could control the area around and certainly be protected from any kind of revolts that took place. And so you see some of the architecture as it would have looked at the time there. So below us is the Kidron Valley, and we're actually standing on what would be the Mount of Olives. This is the view that the disciples and Jesus would have had when they said, look at this place. Look at this magnificent place. Now, it wasn't finished. It didn't look like this just yet. But this was the view that was coming. And Jesus said, it's going to be torn down, and not one stone is going to be left upon another. This was an incredible thing. They had gone from this thing that wasn't very much of anything, Zerubbabel's temple, and Herod was building it into this incredible structure. What are you talking about? It's going to be destroyed. What are you saying? And so they wanted to know more. Just a zoomed in close up here of the temple itself. So you've got the outer court there going into what would be the holy place and the place where the curtain tore when Jesus died. And so this is that. And you can see a lot of the columns and the Greek influence as well on some of those buildings. Yeah, go ahead. Absolutely. On the left side over here with the roof here, just been some of the arcades, the porticos that were there. That may have been that may be a place where they were doing the money changing, things like that in the temple. Yeah, it's hard to know. Some of this is artistic rendition. We don't really know what all the top looked like, but yeah, that may have been a part for a market or where the money changing took place. Yeah, may have been there. That's a great question. Now let's notice some of that Herod's temple. Now construction, as I said, began and ended way after the time of Jesus and Herod himself. Began in 19 BC and was not complete for about 90 years it took to complete this thing. So each successive ruler had to keep going and paying for it, and maybe plans were changed and things were added to it. It was still being constructed for the entire time of Jesus' earthly life. So there was not a time when it was not being constructed when Jesus, during his whole 33 years, however long that was. I think I said 63 or so, 64. It was destroyed in 70. So it was only around for just a few years before the Romans came and completely dismantled it, as Jesus said. Now, I want to notice about the man himself, because that's important when we get into Luke and we read some things about him in the gospel accounts as well. He was a good ruler in the fact that he maintained peace. That's all the Romans cared about. Send us money and don't give us any trouble. Good. Check those two off. He did. His personal life, however, was an absolute mess. And it really helps to know some things about him when we know some things extra biblical, we'll say. He married 10 women. We know 8 of them. He married 2 other people. We don't even know who they were. And including he married a cousin and he married one of his nieces. So, not the best. And was certainly a mess. His second wife was his favorite. She was a Hasmonean princess. They were in the southern part of Judea, near Idumea. He married her in order to consolidate his power. His brother was dead, so he kind of ruled the entire area now that he had married into royalty. However, he was incredibly jealous and incredibly paranoid that someone was going to come and take his throne. And so any hint of revolt or rebellion, he was going to try to put it down. He killed several of his wives, including that second one that was his favorite. He accused her of being against him, and so had her put to death. He drowned his brother-in-law in one of the pools that he had built. He killed one of his mothers-in-law, and he also executed 3 of his own sons because he thought that they were trying to take the throne, or he got a hint that maybe they were kind of doing that, and so he executed 3 of his sons. Not a guy that you want to get on the bad side of, let's say. Yet, as I said, he was a practicing Jew, and so he refrained from any of the uncleanliness laws and that sort of thing. He refused to eat pork. There's a great quote that he was friendly with Augustus Caesar, the first emperor of Rome. There's this great quote that came maybe 100 years or so after Caesar's death, Augustus Caesar. I don't know if it's true or not. I hope it is, because this quote is fantastic. Augustus Caesar said about Herod, "I would rather be Herod's pig than his son." He treats his pigs better than he does his own children, because his sons, if he ever thought they were trying to overrun him, that's it, killed him. And so killed 3 of his sons. So I'd rather be his pig than his sons, according to Augustus Caesar. Along those lines, the slaughter of the innocents. Matthew, we're not going to look at, it's not in Luke. Matthew chapter 2 records just a brief, three verses there, that Herod, because he had heard about, the wise men came and said, we're looking for the king of the Jews. And this incredibly jealous, paranoid man has all the boys 2 years and younger put to death in the vicinity of Bethlehem. The only place it's recorded anywhere is Matthew chapter 2. I'm not talking about just the Bible. I'm talking about anywhere else. No one else records this, which gives a problem to historians because they call into question the account. Maybe it's not true because if this happened, surely we would have read about it. Someone would have said something. No, there's no evidence for it. And so, did it actually happen? Let's notice a few things about that. I know our time is running out. But first of all, as you have to say when you study history, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because I don't have the evidence for it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. History, we know probably 1% of all the things that have ever happened in human history because we don't have evidence for it. But there are some things that we can say are probable and likely, and especially those things that are possible. A number of historians, David Hill, for example, about this account says this account contains nothing that is historically impossible. When you read that about Herod, when you know about the man, there's nothing in that says that doesn't track. This absolutely is something that he would have done. Secondly, it's very possible that while this was obviously a terrible event, killing all of those 2 years old and younger, it's probable that it was on an incredibly small scale. It wasn't all of those in Judea. It was just Bethlehem and perhaps its vicinity, which means there was probably about 20 children that were affected, if this is in fact what happened. One final thing is that's our second bell. There is something that's recorded that Herod actually did, and that's his death execution. He was upset that people didn't like him, the Jews especially, so he commanded that when he died, that 100 Jewish men would be put to death, so that you could rightfully say that when Herod died, there was weeping across the land. We know that happened. Does that sound like someone that would be a threat or threatened by a new king and put infants to death because he was afraid of them? Sure, certainly does. Just because we don't have other evidence for it certainly doesn't mean that it's happened. And Matthew records it, therefore I know it's true. Let's stop right there. We've got a few more things we'll talk about next time, but thanks for your attention today. I appreciate it.